All right, so we're gonna, the way we're gonna structure this, everybody can see me and hear me fine? Yes? Uh, Raise your hand if you have a problem. Okay, so the way we're gonna do this is I'm gonna start the class by talking about that assignment to find a management problem that you wanted to apply Deming's principles to. Um, and we'll talk about those for a few minutes. And then I've got a PowerPoint, a second PowerPoint on management. And Marion, by the way, thank you for asking the questions that you asked at the end of class the last time, because I did find a number of women who are writing about management. I wouldn't characterize any of them as having a theory of management, but they do write about management, and I've got some good ones to share with you today. And I also did some digging into the question of the changing demographics of the workplace and the impact of millennials on the workplace. And so you'll see all of that reflected in the thing today. So if any of the others of you have suggestions like that, please feel free to make them. I'm happy to adjust my content for your observations. All right, well, so a bunch of you picked Emily from the New York Times, and I thought I would start by asking one of you to just talk a little bit about why you picked that one and what your thoughts were about how that situation could be better managed than the snarky remarks from the style editor of the New York Times. So let's start with Dinara. So here's what you do. You unmute your microphone, you talk, and then you mute your right microphone again. So Dinara, you're on.
Okay. I actually am not sure. There wasn't a specific reason why I chose Emily. But I did, I mean, I guess, I've experienced this, well, not, maybe not being given frequent tasks. Although I've never, asked a manager for something to do and then, being given that response of, no, you're good. But I had some suggestions for Emily as well as for her boss. So Emily, I said it sounds like she has to be more proactive in her, she has to, instead of, scrolling through social media, she has to, if she's told or not given a project or she needs to just kind of do some research on her own and do some, educational training on her own and seek that out because, that at least will, point her in the right direction. Let's see. Oh, and that was, let's see. Oh, following point 13 of Deming's 14 points for management, which is institute a vigorous program of education and training. And her boss could do the same thing, suggesting articles or books if he didn't have time or resources to train her. And then I also said that they could follow point 6 of Deming's points for management, which is institute training on the job. Although, it sounds like they don't have a lot of time, but if they were better prepared ahead of time, like having a new hire training plan or schedule, then that would be an effective way to onboard a new person, which would also contribute to their overall, employee happiness. And I also suggested if they were too busy to train her, she could shadow them to learn useful processes and, what needs to be done daily.
Great. That's all a lot more constructive than what was in the New York Times. So anybody, who else had Emily and wants to add to what Dinara said? Hold your hand up if you want to volunteer. Come on, several of you had Emily. Okay, Ashlyn, go ahead.
Yeah, I also said, because Emily.
Can't see you very well, Ashlyn.
What's that?
Can't see you very well. You're quite dark.
Oh, well, here. Is that better?
Yeah, it's much better.
It's another light in this room. I was going to say that I think, Emily had described that it was her first job out of undergrad. So even maybe driving out some of the fear of like that first job and not wanting to mess up and, I think a lot of people when they are younger like that don't tend to be proactive because they don't want to jump in and seem too overeager and get shut down. So I think a training program would help in limiting those kinds of fears maybe, or I mean, just having a manager that's just not too busy to attend to you, having conversations and those kind of things when they
Right, he's making the classic mistake. He's too busy to manage, right?
Exactly.
Great, okay. Marion, did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something, Marion? Or was it somebody else? Somebody else have Emily? Samantha?
Yeah, I had Emily too, and I chose that one because I think that that's an issue that I know I've had at work where maybe training's not done quite as well, and I think that that's a pretty common issue. I chose the training part for Deming on that one, and my suggestion for Emily would be in that case, instead of just asking, is there anything I can help with or anything new I can learn, is to pick a specific task that she's seeing that she doesn't know how to do and ask for help, or ask for someone to show her how to do that specific task. And she might make more progress with that. And then she could also tell her boss too that she thinks it would make it a little bit better throughout the day for her if she were doing that. The other one that I picked on that was the leadership from Deming, because it said that part of a manager and good leadership is to see when you can improve an employee's performance or the workplace and make it better. And so in that case, the manager should be able to see that he should be able to help give her skills to make her do better at her job and make a better work environment.
Great. Dylan? Did you have anything to, was yours the same or was it a different, yours was a different story, wasn't it? Got to unmute your mic, Dylan. There you go.
Mine was different. It was actually based on a personal experience.
Oh, that's right. It was your wife's story. Yeah, tell everybody that story.
Yeah, I think you had mentioned we can do personal stories to kind of offset.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So mine was based on a personal story of a situation that my wife is encountering at her job at the Salem Hospital. And essentially what it is throughout the day, they'll sort of make a judgment early in the morning about a prediction of whether the patient census will be higher in the afternoon. And based in around the morning time, they'll make a decision to send people home or send people on standby. And then in the afternoon, essentially the staff that's left over has to continually pick up the slack and avert to panic mode in order to figure out how to get the job done with half as much staff existing within their departments. And in sort of filtering this through Deming's principles, the idea that it contradicts the most is just the spirit of fear, which is Deming's 8th principle within the structure, that you have people sort of in a constant state of fear as to whether or not, for one, they'll be let go in the morning expecting to work the entire day, but for two, whether they'll be the one that are trying to survive in the afternoon without their department around them. So it is other Deming principles that I saw that it sort of interacts with is the emphasis on short-term profits and short-term thinking rather than more of a sustainable long-term thought process. The suggested solution that I had based on Deming's principles was to maybe offset it by using the afternoon time frame to utilize a little more staff training. If the staff have to go through training and different certifications, that you can sort of shift people into a mode in which they can do a couple hours of their training while they determine whether or not the rest of the day will be busy. Yeah,
so this company's making a classic mistake. I once had a boss who said to me, a CEO who said to me, "You can't save your way to greatness." And that appears to be what these guys are trying to do. They're trying to pinch pennies when in fact they're not dealing with their fundamental problems. So another Deming principle for these guys would be stand back and take a look at the total system because something else is wrong. Yeah. All right, anybody else got one they're bursting to share with the group? Samantha, you should put your hand down. Marion.
Sorry, I just have a question. I was
Okay.
a little unclear from the syllabus whether we were supposed to turn these in. So it seems as though the indication is, yes, we are supposed to turn them in.
Yeah.
Okay.
It'd be great.
Okay.
Just because I like to read them.
Okay.
They're not terribly important from a grading point of view, but keeps me entertained.
Okay.
Okay. Nobody else wants to volunteer tonight? Alex, I think did you have Emily too? I can't remember.
No, I did a different article.
Who did you have?
I wrote about something I saw in the Washington Post.
Oh, could you tell us about it?
Sure. So this is more of just like an overall, like, I don't know, management thing and not a specific situation. But I read about essentially a study that was done that shows that when picking a protege, a manager is about, I think it was like 71% likely to pick someone that's either the same race or gender as them.
Now I remember your piece. Yeah.
So the idea is that there's probably a whole bunch of unconscious biases that we're holding, that while we're choosing someone like a protege, people are doing it with somebody that makes them feel more comfortable. And then again, just putting this through Deming's lens, you're not really optimizing the system when you do it this way. You're not putting people in a place where they can be successful. And also that kind of ties into fears and anxieties, and having people of diverse backgrounds and diverse thought would likely, create a more optimized, more encouraging environment.
Right. Fanan, did you have Emily too?
I did, yeah.
Did you have anything to add? Did you see it from a different angle as any of the others?
Yeah, I was providing some suggestions for
I can't hear you very well.
I'm using this headset that the library gave me. Hold on. I'll just take it off.
Oh, you're at school.
I am, yeah. I couldn't make it home in time. Let me just take this off. Okay.
Oh, it got louder already.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, a little better.
Okay. I was providing some suggestions for the manager, so some for Emily and then for the manager, but I too resonated with this particular situation. I've had internships in positions where I wasn't really utilized much, mainly because my colleagues were super busy and just didn't really allocate enough time to train.
I got much louder now. That's good.
Okay. Didn't have much time to train me or to give me projects and kind of walk me through things. So they just opted to just have me sit around, which created some uncomfortable situations for me. But I suggested that the manager set up weekly meetings with Emily so that they can kind of get to know each other on a more personal level. They can talk about his visions and goals for the team or for the company. And then also Emily would have the opportunity to share some of her goals. And then at that point, they could discuss workload and maybe he can kind of train her on different things. I don't know. It was part of what everyone's been talking about around kind of breaking down some of those barriers and creating better relationships and driving out that fear.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
So I'm very pleased with what you did with this little exercise from a number of points of view. One is that I get a sense that you grasp the Deming principles pretty well and that you like them. I also get a sense that this is a useful thing to do going forward. I'd like to make a slight change in the instructions. And that is to say, obviously, some of you already decided this on your own. You don't have to limit your reading to the New York Times. You can find stories wherever you want to find them. You can do Google News and type management and see what comes up. The other thing is that today is the second lecture that's going to be about general management principles. And so I want you to stretch your horizons in terms of the kind of feedback and advice that you might give based not only on the Deming and Drucker kind of stuff, but on what we're going to talk about today as well. So let's keep trying this. I like this. This is it makes this kind of passive remote thing a little more interactive, and it's interesting for me. So I like it from both points of view. Everybody good with the technology and the way it's working? Any issues? Raise your hand if you've got an issue. Anything wrong? Seems to be working pretty well. Okay, so I am now going to go to screen share mode so I can put my PowerPoint up. And it's going to take me a minute to get organized. I have to move some things around on the screen. There we go. Let's see. Participants will be over here. And chat will be underneath that, and I'll be ready. Okay. Chat is harder for me to use than just holding up your hand and interrupting me. So if I had my preference, I'd rather have you do that. Okay, so I entitled this presentation Managing a Welcoming Workplace because it's partly about diversity, it's partly about empathy, it's partly about employee retention. It's quite different than the lecture that I used when we were together on Saturday. So I want to start by talking about, let's see, there we go, about some of the changes that are taking place in the workplace that are, I think, obvious to all of us. The last US Census was in 2010. Of course, they're planning another one now. But at that time, you know, the white population dominated the workforce and the population, and that is going to change dramatically in the relatively near future. The overall society and particularly in the workforce. So that's going to change the dynamic in the workplace and create new challenges for managers. Another big thing that's going to happen, that tattooed lady on the bottom is sort of symbolic of it, is that there's going to be a lot of old people in America. God willing, I'll be one of them. And they're going to change things for marketers. They're going to change things for managers, and business is going to have to understand that group and relate to it. And so it's another management challenge that we're going to have to think about. In today's workforce, there are two big changes. The one is, as Marion was pointing out last Saturday, millennials are now the largest generation in the workforce, and so their views on work and the challenges that they bring to managers are going to have to be considered very heavily. White workers are dropping as a percentage of the total, and the workforce is basically at this point about 50-50 men and women, and the Harris poll characterizes 40% of those women as in some kind of supervisory or managerial role. And half of those women are going to work in management or professional occupations like communications. So I don't know about your workforces, but the workforces that I managed were, you know, largely female. Let's see, what do I do here? Okay. So here are some of the things I learned about the attitudes of millennials toward work. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to volunteer to give me your perspective on this. So there's this whole notion of work as meaningful and purposeful that is apparently much more important to millennials than other workers in the past. That they want to be stretched and they want to learn and grow. I'm not sure how that's that dramatically different from others. They like concrete results and real world work, not theoretical work. And the last two are particularly important. because one of the things that I know about millennials is that there's much more of a desire to work in an environment that's complementary to the rest of your life, to your lifestyle. I went to work for an insurance company, and like, who cares about insurance? Like, it wasn't something that I was dying to, get deeply involved in. But then you do once you start working there. But millennials are being choosier than that. If they're outdoor oriented, then they want to work in the outdoor industry. If they're scientifically oriented, they want to work in the healthcare industry, and so on and so forth. I say they, including you, most of you, I think. And the other thing is that they expect to work in a diverse environment, that their daily lives exist in a diverse environment, and they would be shocked or troubled by walking into an environment that was single dimensional. So how does that list jibe with your understanding of millennials' attitudes toward work? Anybody want to comment? Remember, guys, I'm expecting this to be a conversation, so speak up. Okay, Ashlyn.
I'm in agreement with most of those things. I think definitely as more millennials are entering the workforce, things like work-life balance are becoming more, I won't say expected, but like more of the norm. So I think there's more workplaces that are looking at ways that they can do like more remote work or, flexible time and things like that to keep that segment of the workforce attracted, instead of being like, okay, so we work, 60 hours a week and that's just what we do nowadays. So.
Anybody else? Anything to annotate or amplify on this list? Something missing?
Yeah, I can't figure out how to do the little hand raise thing with this view. But I agree. I think for a lot of those, it kind of hits on the way that I view it also, especially on wanting to have meaning behind your work. I think we spend so much time where we're at and the people that we're with that you have to really enjoy what you're doing. And the job that I have now, I think is meaningful work, and it's much more like personally fulfilling than any of the other jobs that I've had in the past. And so I think that really helps make it like an enjoyable workplace and makes it feel like I'm spending my day doing something good.
Good. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Jack?
Yes, I think I have one. Sorry, can you hear me? I changed my setup again.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, I will try to fix that after this comment. I apologize. One thing for me that's not on that list is I expect that the suggestions of digital natives, the millennial, maybe Gen Z are the digital natives, but I think millennials are as close enough. And I think that we expect our suggestions for optimizations and changes, especially as relates to anything digital in the workplace, to be taken seriously and to actually be considered by management. And now that we're the largest segment of the workforce, like you just said, I hope to see that happening more. But yeah, that our ideas, especially in the digital realm, are given appropriate weight, given that that's what we grew up with. I think that's an expectation that I definitely have.
Great. That's great. Anybody else? I'm going to move on. Okay. So the last point there was that they expect diversity in the workplace. And so I want to talk a little bit about, my cuckoo clock's going off. My cuckoo clock has I got to turn it off. Hold on. Sorry about that. I have an old cuckoo clock that was given to me by my great uncle, and it's developed a mind of its own. It cuckoos as many times as it wants to, whenever it wants to. So I apologize, I turned it off. I talked about diversity, and so I want to talk a little bit about diversity and the management challenges that are associated with diversity. So the first quote from Marilyn Laurie is Marilyn Laurie was for many years the head of corporate communications at AT&T, very widely respected woman in the business. And I like her definition a lot because I think it captures not only what diversity is, but what the benefit of diversity is, because the value of human differences is really at the center of my understanding of this topic. So diversity, of course, is equity across every category of humankind. And it's interesting that that one piece that you found in the Washington Post, Alex, about the 71% is absolutely borne out by the data that existed before. I didn't see that story, but there's no question that we gravitate toward people who look like us, and that creates a zero-sum game in a business. I can remember that my New York managing director was particularly frustrated with the lack of diversity in the New York office because we're in New York City, and so we're in a place where it should be easy to have a broad spectrum of views and backgrounds and orientations and skin colors in a New York City PR firm, but they were mostly young white women. And so we looked at the process, like Deming says, stand back and look at the process and see if there's a problem in the process. Well, here was the process. The process was when there was an opening on a team, generally it was the junior person who was given the assignment to screen the resumes and come up with a list of finalists for the more senior people to consider. Well, she was a white girl. And so following this principle, she picked people like her. And so there was a flaw in the system, and it tended to limit the diversity in the New York office. So we got to be careful about that. It's a natural tendency of human beings, and we need to be careful to subordinate it. This is a series of questions I wanted to ask you to comment on. You saw the trend, you saw the direction that things are going on. What do you think the workforce in the future looks like? Does it look more diverse, more varied, more intergenerational, or do you think that that this is a short-term phenomenon? Jackson, or do you still have your hand up from the last time? Whoa.
Oh, sorry, that was still up from the last time.
Oh, okay. Mitchell, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I spoke to a friend last night, and he brought up an interesting point in terms of like who could potentially be the next president. And he mentioned that Michelle Obama, she seems to be on a path similar to that Donald Trump was on in terms of starting promoting themselves for the presidential election.
Oh, with the book?
I mean, she's done a lot of things, but I guess he's just informed me about her path, I guess, or the potential for her to potentially run for president. And I thought it was really interesting on this topic that, to have a Black female running for president, it would certainly open up a lot of doors for just a larger diversity within businesses and companies across such a wide array. So I just think, yeah, definitely diversity. I mean, regardless of who is president, but I mean, if we have someone, a Black woman who runs our country, I think it certainly would be a beautiful thing for everyone from a diversity standpoint.
Marion?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's always going to be probably the situation in leadership where it's less age diverse than it would be, because obviously people who have been in positions longer are more in a position to be leadership. I think the exception to that is if you look at startups and things like that, although as technology becomes more widespread, I think it's going to be more equal opportunity age-wise. But I think given the Me Too movement and having Obama having been president, and just all of those types of cultural changes are really pointing us into the direction of a more diverse, not only workforce, but also leaders.
Good. So this is my take on the value of diversity. I think that there are both qualitative and quantitative reasons to drive diversity in your organization. First of all, in the communications business, we're just better at our jobs if we have more input from more views to consider in the way that we plan our communications. I think it enriches our work product substantially. It also improves the culture of the workplace because equity increases engagement, and that's quantitatively supported. And engagement is what makes employees work better and faster and more productive. There is also a public interest element to diversity. I mean, I think that businesses, especially businesses like ours, that tend to, feel like we have the voice of the public, that those kinds of businesses have a requirement to make sure that their workforce reflects the larger demographics of the communities that they serve. And there's a lot of real good data that says that companies make more money if they're more diverse. That University of Chicago study says every 1% increase in diversity correlates to a 9% increase in revenue. That's an amazing number. And so I think that when I think about the value of diversity, these are the kinds of things that I think about. So once again, I want to ask you guys, when you think about diversity and the contribution that it makes to the workplace, is there anything that I missed or anything you'd like to comment on in terms of how diversity makes the workplace better? Mitchell, I think your hand is still up from last time. Come on, guys, I need you to talk to me. Nobody? Well, you guys are burned out. Let's see, nobody's volunteering? Okay, then let's ask Kayla. Anything about this that strikes you as different in one way or another? Kayla, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, just
Okay.
barely.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Is that better? Yeah, let's see. So, yeah, I mean, I think you already said it, but I think culture in particular, like workplace culture, I think that's been one of those sort of, it's a hot topic right now. And at least the organization that I work for, so much of what we do is we're trying to help like decenter whiteness, but like also build a culture of inclusion with regards to diversity, because I think so many people, when you're talking about creating like a more diverse workplace, like sure, you can bring in people of color, you can bring in people of different orientations or whatever, but like to make those people feel included, that's an entirely different animal. And so much of that has to do with like building a culture where people really feel heard and valued and seen. And it can be anything from how you structure your staff meetings to what's on the walls. And so I just think it really, and it ties into some of these other things you said too, but like perspective as well. But I think that it really like forces people to shift their way of like understanding and culture, and like not just in the workplace, but outside of the workplace. Like if you're really including all of the diverse perspectives in the workplace and shifting your workplace culture, like so that people are actually like operating like in new ways of being, then it sort of trickles out into people's everyday lives too. And so it's like, I think it's transformative beyond just like a professional sense, but also just like personally transformative, which I think is really important.
Karen, welcome. Hello, Karen, welcome. Glad to see you. You can turn your mic on. You know how to do that? You have to unmute your mic so you can talk to us. There you go. I can't hear you though. No, I still can't hear you. Turn up your volume. Now you're muted. There you go. Try now. No, still can't hear you. Well, I think you're going to have to get with Matt and figure out what's wrong with your microphone. Okay. Let's see. I wanted to ask. Oh, Matt, are you still on, Matt? Matt Schmidt, are you still there? I think he was going to leave. Okay, well, we'll go on without him. So I'm glad you talked about the culture thing because I'm having trouble going backwards. There we go. Because I'm going to talk quite a bit about engagement, employee engagement, because it's one of the challenges that diversity brings. So just a couple of case studies that I thought I'd mention to you. They're interesting. So Northwestern University did a study where they took two groups of people and gave them the same murder mystery. You know, have you ever been to one of these parties? Or you know what I'm talking about, right? And so they gave two groups the same murder mystery, and they did this about 50 times. And one of the groups was a diverse group, and the other group was a single-dimensional group. And every single time, the diverse groups figured the mystery out faster and better than the less diverse groups. So, you know, it's kind of interesting real-world perspective on the issue. McKinsey is a big management consulting firm, I think you know, and they did a big study and found that there was a direct connection in the opinion of the managers between gender diversity and financial success. So there's data that says that you make more money doing it too. I don't know how many of you know that image there. That's from a movie called 12 Angry Men. And I said 12 less effective angry white men because that's what the picture shows and that's what the movie was about. But this was another study that they did at Tufts. So Dr. Summers did a study, and they studied diverse juries and less diverse juries. And routinely, the diverse juries were just better at being juries. They asked smarter questions. They reached agreement more successfully. They just worked better. And so this reinforces my view that, you know, the bottom line on diversity is it just works better. And it's good for all the other reasons as well. So let's talk a little bit about how you build and manage a diverse workforce. The first one is to study the issue and understand it really well. Know who does it well, who does it badly, and know something about the attitudes and opinions of the people inside your own organization. The second thing is that a lot of companies will have like a diversity program or a diversity committee or a diversity director, and that's a big mistake because the bottom line is that everybody's got to own it in order for it to work well. And then I think the final thing is that it's a journey, a continuous journey, and that any organization that is going to continue to have a rich perspective, a rich, diverse perspective, is going to have to keep working on it all the time. It's not something that you do and then it goes away. You can't talk about diversity without talking about some of the challenges that diversity creates in the workforce, right? So we know that there's been a tremendous amount of attention paid to the kind of workplace challenges that exist in a diverse environment, and we don't need to belabor them. but I do want to talk specifically about microaggression because is that a topic that's familiar? Raise your hand if you're familiar with the topic microaggression. Is that something you know about? A few of you anyway. Okay, you can. Okay, thank you, Luca. You can put your hands down. I did a big study. I used to run a foundation in the PR business, the PR Safe Foundation, that was focused on trying to drive diversity in communications. And we did a big study with the City University of New York of young and middle-level minority members, and learned a lot about microaggression. So microaggression is the intentional or unintentional interaction that you have with someone that demeans them in some way, that makes them feel like outsiders, that makes them feel like you're patronizing them, that makes them feel like you're singling them out. And so I know that many of you have been exposed to these kinds of things. I picked a few of them that I know. Does everybody know who that agency is at the bottom? OMFG Co. They're a very hip Portland communications company, and they posted that up on Instagram a couple of days ago. But these kinds of statements really do create problems for people in the workforce, and problems that don't necessarily get articulated or complained about, but that are just there. And they're very hard to wrench out of the dialogue. You know, I mean, I'm sure all of you have been to a restaurant sometime in the last 6 months where the waitress said, "So what do you guys want?" when it wasn't all guys. And those kinds of comments are what sort of captured in the topic of microaggression. So what can managers do to drive diversity, to manage diversity more successfully, embrace the point of view that it is indeed something that makes your organization stronger? One of the things that is an absolute requirement for managers today is to make the rules on harassment and discrimination crystal clear and enforce them without exception. I think that anybody who's not doing that today is just dumb. I think that training on microaggression is really useful. We did a training program at my firm, and it really helped because I think a lot of people don't really recognize the degree to which those things impact others. And we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about empathy. And then focus on retention is an important point. The culture and the climate of your organization is probably the #1 most important thing in keeping people happy at their jobs. There's lots of things that keep people happy at their jobs, but a variable that you can really work on as a manager is to create a welcoming climate where everybody's welcome. Let's see. So I couldn't resist doing this because this was my approach. So when I was running the firm, what I tried to do was create a sense of pride in the organization, celebrate successes. I had a bell outside my office that I'd ring every time we won a new client. I would reward smart risk-taking even if it failed, as a way of showing people that they should take chances. And of course, emphasizing teamwork is another way to create a positive, welcoming climate.
Hey, Lou.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I think Kayla has something.
I want you to interrupt. Go ahead.
Kayla, did you have something to say or to contribute to?
Who wanted to speak?
I thought Kayla had something to say. Sorry. Maybe not.
I did, but let's just move on.
You sure?
Thank you, Fanon. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk specifically about managing communications as opposed to general management, because I think there are some things that are different in our business that we should talk about. Creating this kind of welcoming climate is going to require us to pay attention to some things that maybe other managers don't need to pay attention to. So one is a diversity of assignments. In other words, I know that the workplace is enriched when we move people around and you put them on different things. They get interested in something new. They get a chance to work with a different group of people. So, avoiding the temptation to sort of, put people into a team and leave them there because the team is doing well and is probably a mistake. I also think that, we do a lot of reviewing of people's work, right? Because we're doing writing and we're doing, we're developing communications tools. And so they get reviewed, they get edited by supervisors and by peers in the organization. And we have to be careful to know the difference between critiquing and criticizing, right? In other words, you got to find a way to critique something, help to try to make it better without sounding like you're being cranky about it. And it's a fine line. I also think that quality control can be a great motivation driver if you use it the way that Deming does. In other words, that, quality control where you're working in teams to solve problems, working together to understand how to make the system better, continuously working on improvement is a great way to keep people engaged and involved. Somebody mentioned the Monday morning meeting in the context of one of the news articles, and I know that sharing knowledge and sharing perspective on what's going on in the total organization is another good way to keep communications people engaged and informed. And of course, matching people's assignments to the things they care about is also really critical. This is a professor from the Yale School of Management, and she's going to talk about how people define their jobs in order to find satisfaction in their work, no matter how demeaning the work is.
Thank you, Adam, and good morning. I am delighted to be here with all of you, and I would like to start my comments with a story. And the story has to do with the University Hospital cleaning crew that Jane Dutton, Galai Debeba, and I studied some years ago. And we went to study this cleaning crew to understand the nature of the meaning of their work. We were interested in understanding how they experienced their work, what they enjoyed in it, what they found lacking, and so on. And what we found in that study was something that stunned us and has inspired a number of studies that we've done since and that others have done in picking up the mantle of this. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about what that was. In going into the organization and in talking with the people who worked on the cleaning crew about what it was they did each day in their work and how they experienced it and how they felt about it, we found first a group of cleaners who talked about it in exactly the way that you would expect based on the research literature on this kind of job. They didn't talk about it as being particularly satisfying. They said it wasn't particularly high skilled. They talked about being there for the benefits of the work. And when they described what the tasks of the work involved, they described exactly what the job description of the organization listed. On the other hand, we talked with a group of cleaners who talked about the job in very different terms. They enjoyed the work, they found it deeply meaningful, they thought of the work as being very highly skilled, and when we asked them about the tasks and the relationships that comprised the work, they talked about completely different things than the first group. So this piqued our curiosity, and we started to wonder if there was a difference between the two groups with respect to the kinds of units they worked on, the shifts they worked on, who it was they were in contact with, and things like that, and could find no differences whatsoever between these two groups. In the second group, for example, in asking the cleaners about the kinds of things they were doing on the job, they described cleaning patient rooms each day and paying attention to which patients seemed to be upset, on the verge of tears, not having had many visitors that week, so that they could double back in the course of their shift to spend time with them, see if they'd like to have a conversation, give them an opportunity to cry. They talked about doing things like walking the elderly visitors of patients all the way back through the Byzantine structure of the hospital to their cars, which was an offense for which they could be fired, so that the visitors would not get lost, thus worrying the patient about whether their family members were okay. In perhaps the best known example from the work that we did, one of the members of the cleaning crew we talked with worked on a floor that cared for patients who were in comas and were hopefully coming out of those comas and beginning the long work toward rehabilitation and recovery. And in describing the tasks that were part of her job, she described taking down the pictures that hung in the hospital patients' rooms on a regular basis and moving them around, switching them around between rooms. And when we asked her why it was she did this, she said that her thought was perhaps something about changing some aspect in the environment of the patients, though they were unconscious, might spark recovery in some way. We became very intrigued by this and asked, is this part of your role, given that you work on this kind of floor? And what she told us was, that's not part of my job, but that's part of me. And so in trying to pull apart in the organization, with the administration of the hospital, with the managers and so on, what it was that was happening here, what we realized was there were hospital cleaning staff members who were engaging the work in a completely different way, without the knowledge of management, without the knowledge of administration, in fact, often breaking the rules that were part of their job description to do the work in the way that they were doing. And that got us interested in understanding this phenomenon a little bit more deeply. And so in work that we've done in several organizations since then, we've come to call this practice job crafting. And what we mean by job crafting is the following. In work with Justin Berg and Jane Dutton, we define it as what employees do to redesign their own jobs from the bottom up in a way that fosters their engagement at work, their satisfaction with their work, their resilience, and their thriving. And we talk about this as taking three different forms. So the first form is task crafting, in which individuals change the number, the type, or the nature of the tasks that they do. So an example would be the hospital cleaning staff member who changed around the pictures on the patient's walls. The second form is relational crafting, in which individuals change the nature of the relationships, interactions, and so on that they have on the job in ways that change how they think about the meaning of their work. An example of this might be someone who works in the legal department of an organization forging relationships with a new product team so that they can help to anticipate and facilitate the challenges that that team may likely encounter in bringing that product to market, as opposed to being in a reactive mode and being part of the group that everyone has to sort of pass through and go through before they're able to bring the product to market. And then finally, the third form that we talk about and have studied is cognitive crafting. And this is about changing how people perceive the tasks and their meaning. One of the things that was interesting in the study that we did is we asked every single cleaner we talked with, what is your role here in the organization? And those who worked in what I would classify as this first set would give us their technical job title that the university hospital used. But in the second group, we were more likely to hear things like, I'm an ambassador for the hospital, or in one case, I'm a healer. And when we asked the person, well, what is it exactly that you mean by this? She described, well, I create sterile spaces in which patients heal, but I also do everything that I can to facilitate that, whether it's caring for them, caring for their families, coordinating with their nurses, and so on. Now, why did...
Okay, I want to stop there. I want to stop there because I want to ask you all about job crafting. Have any of you ever had a similar experience to the one that she's describing, where you've used one of those principles? I would like to back up to it if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. Task crafting, relational crafting, or cognitive crafting. Have any of you ever had any experiences at work where you were able to craft the job to fit you better? Marion?
I haven't done it myself personally, but when I was in a newspaper, I supervised a reporter who they had the city beat, basically, so they covered a bunch of city council meetings and things like that. But on the way from where she parked her car when going to city council meetings and walking to City Hall,
Go ahead.
Sorry, there was a sort of a group of homeless like tents in a place, and so she would stop and talk to the residents of that little tent group there on her way to and from the council. And they always asked her what had happened at the council meeting, which caught her attention because she just thought it was interesting that that they were, you know, civically engaged, at least to some degree. And eventually she ended up doing asking permission to do a whole series of stories about that group of people and kind of the larger issue of homelessness in the.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story.
But it was kind of funny. She was just really surprised that they cared.
Yeah. Allison, did you want to add something?
Yeah, it's actually a lot of what my job is, working a nonprofit, because each one of our families has a different story. Their disease affects them a different way. Every family, I have to kind of mold my job to meet their needs, and therefore, you know, and in turn it meets my own. Kind of, you get different satisfaction out of that relationship, and seeing, you know, we have some families who have been doing this for a really long time and they just kind of do their thing and they don't need anything from us. And we have other families who my job is to listen and be a shoulder to cry on. And so with every family it changes, and it's really interesting to kind of watch where, you know, different people are affected differently by CF, especially because the treatments are really, really expensive. And, you know, we have some families that live in Portland and are financially really stable, and then some who live in really rural areas where that equipment is hard to come by. They have to come to Portland to be seen. So being able to kind of craft my relationship with them and my job to meet their needs, I do it every day.
That's a great example. Selena, did you have something you wanted to suggest as far as job crafting is concerned?
No, I've actually never done any of those, unfortunately.
They're great. Okay, well, we'll keep going. So an important part of this discussion is about empathy. Empathy has become a hot topic in business, at least partly because I'm leaning over to get a copy of the book. There it is. This is, let's see if I can, there you go, hit refresh. So the author is the CEO of Microsoft. And so he's written this book where he talks about, well, the subtitle of the book is The Quest to Rediscover Microsoft's Soul and Imagine a Better Future for Everyone. And so he talks a lot about empathy. Authors are writing books about empathy in the workplace, and it's become a hot topic. I have to admit that I didn't have a lot of patience for this topic when I first encountered it. I said, really? I mean, you need to really care about the person you're talking to? Like, that's an insight? That doesn't feel like a management insight to me. That just feels like plain old common sense. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my impatience with the subject of empathy is partly because I'm not empathetic enough. And so I ended up sort of connecting with this topic a little more on a personal level than I thought I would. So let's just talk about empathy and the role that it plays in the workplace. So Nadella calls it the ability to perceive others' thoughts and feelings. And he, of course, because he's a scientist, did a formula for empathy. Empathy plus shared values plus safety and reliability equals trust over time. So Nadella, I didn't like Nadella's book at all. I was tempted to recommend it to you because Microsoft plays a large role in the school's advisory board, or whatever we call it, professional advisory board. But I didn't like his book because it was too personal. It was too much of a memoir and not enough of a business book. And I found much better examples. So Brene Brown wrote this book, Dare to Lead, and her definition of empathy is a little different than Nadella's. She said it's connecting to the emotions that underpin an experience, and I like that definition. In other words, that stuff happens, stuff unfolds in the workplace. Things are going on. You're interacting with employees who are either bringing you something for your approval or asking a question or whatever it is. And I know that personally, I have to work at trying to pay attention to what's going on beneath the surface, right? Because there's lots of ways to pay more attention to the emotional component of your interaction with your employees. And we're going to talk about some of the tools for doing that. And then Michael Ventura wrote a book called Applied Empathy, and he says it's about seeing the world through someone else's eyes, or sometimes also called walking in other people's shoes. So there's different ways that empathy, that we encounter the need for empathy in the workplace. The obvious one is the boss's empathy toward the employee, right? That you as a manager need to, try to understand not just the content of your interaction with your employees, but the emotional underpinnings behind it. Workers' empathy toward each other. And then, of course, there's the external side of empathy, which is empathy toward the customer. And there's lots of examples of companies that just weren't paying attention to the customer and who, in fact, whole industries like the music industry, and who just sat out dramatic changes in their marketplace because they weren't paying attention. So this is how I understand empathy works. That what it does is it gives you a richer understanding of the people who are working for you, for your customers, for the owners of the organization. An empathetic understanding is richer than just understanding the content, I guess is a way to say that. And it works better. It improves your management skill and your communication skills. So one of the things that I teach is I teach how to do target audience profiles. Did you get any of that in any of your courses? Did you get working on both the demographic and psychographic attributes of the audiences that you're trying to influence? I see some nodding. Well, yeah. So I mean that's something I've spent a lot of time working on. And an audience profile is in fact a way of sort of getting under the skin of the target audience that you're working against by enriching your view not only on the basis of their demographic profile, but on their likes and dislikes. So how do you develop empathy, I guess I've been working on this myself, and I challenge you to work on it too. One of the things that I know is that I talk too much. I dominate conversations. I step on other people's lines. I figure out what you're going to say before you're finished saying it and interrupt you. That's not very empathetic. And it doesn't work very well in the workplace. And so you've got to start by recognizing your own feelings and your own weaknesses and say, well, where do I need to improve in terms of my own self-awareness on how I interact with each other, with other people, controlling an instinct like an instinct to interrupt, understanding people at a social level and not just a business level. All of those things are important. But I picked that little visual of self-control because for me, in order to be empathetic, I need to slow down and listen a lot more. That's my weak spot on empathy. So let me ask you all the same question then. So if empathy is an important management skill, what do you guys have? I hear you guys. What do you all feel you might have to work on in terms of improving your own ability to be empathetic toward others? Any thoughts about that? A little self-reflection. Allison, or is that your? Oh, Mitchell, you have your hand up.
I think it just comes down to listening first, allowing your employee or your friend, whoever it is in the situation, to finish their thoughts. You know, really truly allow them to complete what they're saying before you feel the urge to interject. And it's something I work on with my partner, and in any situation or interaction, whether it's in school or work or with a significant other or family member. I just think we all want to hear ourselves talk, but we need to listen first.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And by the way, I meant to say this, and I'm glad you mentioned it. These are lessons that can help in other parts of our lives as well, not just in our work management. Lucas. Luke, did you want to say something? Luke? We're not hearing you. That's interesting. Is he still there? Oh, there's something wrong with your audio. Sorry. Okay, well, you're going to have to. Oh, by the way, in the chat section, Matt Schmidt has his email and cell phone. So if you want to call him now, Matt, and see if you can fix that, Mitch, then that would be fine. All right, who else wanted to? Jack, did you want to say something?
Yeah, although it's more or less just seconding what Mitchell said, that a big first step to empathy is giving.
A little louder, please, Jack.
Oh, sorry, I'll do this. That a big first step to empathy is giving or creating that space where people feel like they can fully express themselves and they're not going to get their toes stepped on, or they're not going to get immediately contradicted or slapped down, because that's a reason that a lot of communication never happens, is because people simulate it in their head and they say, oh, well, what if I just immediately get disagreed with, or I immediately get dismissed? And establishing a space where people know that that isn't what's going to happen is so important.
I think that's great. Anybody else got anything they want to say about empathy or their own challenges with regard to empathy? Experiences with less than empathetic bosses? Kayla?
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, actually just kind of tagging on to what the other two people have said, but around listening too, I think with listening, it's like there's listening and also listening to understand, and then there's like listening to respond. So like if you're really listening to someone fully, then like after they share, you might reflect back like what you heard from them, so that they know that they're actually heard. And I think that's part of like creating a safer creating a space where people feel safe sharing. It's like you're actually listening and you're not just waiting for the moment that I stop talking so then you can sort of bring it back to yourself. I think that's another super important part of listening.
Absolutely. That's great. Uh-oh, somebody, there you go, it was Lucas.
I fixed my microphone.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, good. Go ahead, Ben.
What I was going to say about empathy, I like Kayla's point, and I like Jack's point too. It kind of goes off that a little bit. I feel like empathy is like, the difference is sympathy, you listen, and then you don't, it's about just kind of sitting there and being someone who listens and says, you know, that must be really hard. Kind of like trying to put yourself in their situation and not give them advice. I think sympathy, you give advice and you don't really feel that emotion, but I think in empathy, you kind of just hear them and you just kind of listen, and you just kind of ask them, well, have you tried doing this? Like offering ways that they can kind of change not their perspective, because that's like advice giving is changing perspective, but just trying to lend them something to listen to, but also just just really, it's kind of just, I think it kind of goes down to what Mitchell says, just kind of like listening and not interjecting yourself into their feelings.
I want you to know I was tempted to interrupt you 3 times during that little statement, but I stopped myself. Fanon, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, can you hear me? Because I have my headphones back
Yes,
in.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Kind of in the same vein, as I was kind of thinking of my own experience with empathy, something that I struggle with, when I have someone disclose information and are looking for me to kind of listen and to be there as a support, something that I struggle with is kind of sharing my own experience as a way to make them feel comfortable and make them feel as if they're not alone. And sometimes I think I might, I have a hard time balancing sharing my experience and then giving them room to, and then tying it back to their experience and like giving them room to like, to finish up their thoughts and to share whatever they want to share. So I don't know, like I think there's a fine line of like, hey, I've also been through this, you're not alone, but also like I'm here to listen and I don't want to take up too much space. And
yeah, right.
So
the classic mistake is calling a friend and saying my mother died, and the friend says, oh, let me tell you about when my mother died.
yeah, I think that's
not empathy.
Right.
I had a great example this week because I had horrible internet problems this week. We have Ben Broadband, and we have our phone and internet and TV all on one cable box. I mean, so when it goes down, everything goes down, and we're out of. The only way I could communicate with the world was on my cell phone, and so I called the helpline, the tech line at Ben Broadband. And the first time I called, I got some guy on the phone who had a script in front of him and said, oh, I'm very sorry to hear that you're having that problem, sir, and I will do everything that I can to help you overcome it. The next guy I talked to, because I had to call about 6 times, the next guy that I talked to said, oh man, that really sucks when that happens. It happened to me a week or so ago, and I didn't know what to do. I was like, without any connection to the real world. And well, I like that guy much better. I immediately made a better connection with that guy than with the guy that was reading the script. So I think that empathy is a really powerful tool, and I do think that it does start with self-control and paying attention. So here's what the data says about empathy. Be non-judgmental. I mean, this is a very hard thing to do. We were saying earlier that you tend to gravitate toward people that look like you. Well, you also are judgmental about people who fall into categories that you can't help but feeling issues about. Like if and you've got to be really careful to be non-judgmental when someone's talking to you, particularly when they're talking to you about a problem. And one of the ways to practice being non-judgmental is to think about your own tough issues. Like, what is it that you wrestle with that is, the kind of thing that you would hope someone else would be empathetic toward? I think that's a pretty good trick for trying to uncover your vulnerabilities on empathy. That repetition, Fanon, that's a very good point. Repetition is a really good way to reinforce that you're paying attention and that you're following. And a great way to say that is to basically paraphrase what they said and give it back to them so that you're feeling like you're in sync. And finally, the last one is something that is really very obvious, but also very important, and that is that body English tells you a lot. When someone's got their arms folded and they're listening to you like this, that's a whole different thing from someone who's listening to you in a more open way. And so paying attention to the body English is a really good way to make empathetic connections. Good? Okay. Whoops. So this woman, Brene Brown, that wrote the book Dare to Lead, had some advice with regard to empathy and some of the things that get in the way of empathy. One of the things that we know is that we avoid tough conversations. I have a story that my wife tells people all the time. I was a young manager. I had an older guy working for me who was doing very badly. It was pretty clear that we needed to terminate the relationship. And I had he worked in another city, and I had his phone number on my desk, and I pushed the piece of paper around for about 2 weeks because I was avoiding the tough conversation. And the guy had a heart attack during this period. And so then I called his wife and asked how he was doing. I called his doctor and I told him the circumstances, and the doctor said, "Oh, you should talk to him while he's in the hospital. It'll give him something else to think about besides his problems." Well, I wasn't sure that was a good idea, but the bottom line is that I avoided that tough conversation and it made it even tougher. Another pitfall is something that I think was talked about a little bit when we were talking about Deming, which is that lots of bosses focus on the things that are wrong rather than also reinforcing the things that that you're doing that are good and saying you need to do more of that. I forget, who was it that said that? Was that you, Dinar? I don't remember. Somebody said that they had a boss that focused too much on the negative. Risk avoidance is another obstacle to empathy that we end up focusing on shame and blame instead of on accountability and learning, and that should look very familiar to you because that's a classic Deming line. And then we talked about confusing sympathy with empathy. So I have a piece from Brene Brown. She did this thing called TASK. This is the accountability and success checklist for clarity. Who owns the task? Do they have the authority to be accountable? Are they set up for success? Do we have a checklist of what needs to happen? And so this is this feedback idea is paint done for me. In other words, show me what this is going to look like when it's done, and that'll help me to understand what I need to do to get there. She's a very smart manager, and I thought I'd play a little of her stuff.
We're looking at it, and we saw ribs. My technician, he said,
"Okay, here we go." You can hear that all right? Nod? Yes?
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Good stuff. Let's see, close that and go on from here. So another thing that came up in our first class was, I forget, it might have been Samantha said, well, you know, it's not always rosy. I mean, sometimes you have to make tough decisions about people. And I think that in the context of a conversation about a welcoming workplace and in the context of a conversation about empathy, it is a good time to talk about the termination decision, because you're right. There are times when it doesn't work out, and there's times when you have to make a difficult decision about an employee and an employee's future. And so when that happens, how do you do that in a way that doesn't destroy the culture and reinforces a culture of empathy and teamwork and caring? And the bottom line on how to do that is to give people a way out with dignity. It's being empathetic about the feelings and concerns of the person who's getting the bad news, right? Because, you know, we all know that there's fear in the workplace, and that part of that fear is rooted in the fear that the organization can always tell you that you shouldn't come to work tomorrow. And so, you know, connecting with that feeling is a pretty important part of doing this job correctly. And we tend not to do it. We tend instead to be defensive. We tend to recognize that, we tend not to recognize that giving someone a dignified way of dealing with their termination, it costs time and money, but is well worth the expenditure in time and money for the impact that it has on the rest of the people in the workforce. Because, you know, I mean, if it's a layoff and, you know, 10% of the workforce is going to be gone, then you're going to pull the 90% of the workforce that's left together after the layoff happens and talk to them about the future of the organization. And if you haven't provided the people who are leaving with a dignified exit, then you're not going to be received very well by the people that are left. And another thing that is an obstacle to success is that, you know, this is very Deming, that leaders tend to blame a team member rather than taking accountability for the failure themselves. You know, Deming says, look at the systems and look at the processes before you start to blame somebody for something that's wrong. So it's an aspect of work and management that we have to deal with. And I think empathy is a good guide for dealing with that in an effective way. Okay. Just a little wrap up. I've got some quotes here that I like that have to do with management views. Casey, you know who Casey Stengel is? He was the longtime manager of the New York Yankees during their most celebrated championship seasons. And he says, keep the guys that hate you away from the guys that haven't made their minds up yet. And that's the best way to manage. Sam Walton buys the view that the customer is the boss. Stephen Covey, whose book I hated, leadership determines whether the ladder's leaning against the right wall. I suppose that's a smart observation. Tom Watson was the chairman for many years of IBM. Bringing out the energies and talents of the people is the boss's job. I think that's right. Jack Welch, who I don't think as highly of since he divorced his wife and married a younger woman, said he's the gatekeeper and transmitter of ideas. But David Ogilvy, who was one of the smartest managers I ever knew, I think says it best. Hire people that are better than you are, and then leave and let them get on with it. That's particularly true for creative people, as I said in our first session. So, one final thought. The message sent doesn't always mean it's the message that was received.
What this organization desperately needs is change.
That's it. That's what I got. Questions, comments? Anybody want to talk some more about any of this before we wrap up? We've got 30 whole seconds left before the session's supposed to be over. Anything else to be said?
I had a question about the case study that you sent out.
Yes.
In the email that you sent out, you said that you're extending the deadline from the 21st, but in the syllabus it was already set to be due on the 21st.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
So is it just, it is the 21st?
I didn't extend it. Hold on a second. Let me see. It's a typical mistake of the kind that I make. It was supposed to be due on the 21st in the syllabus, Samantha?
Yes. Yes, in the syllabus it says the 21st.
Okay, so I was going to try to extend it to the 28th.
To the 28th? Okay.
Everybody get that? I just wanted to give you a little more time. I know you're busy with your capstones. All right, well, let's do a quick. Donna's going to ask me how it went, and she's going to want to know how let me stop sharing. How the technology worked, how you guys felt about this as a class compared to the in-person classes that you've been experiencing for the last 2 years. Do we lose a lot by doing it this way? How do you feel about the experience of a virtual hour and a half with me? Jack?
I actually think it worked great from a technology perspective. It's nice having the PowerPoints up on our own personal screens, I think. I wish we could have that on our laptops during in-person classes, actually. I think that was better than in-person classes.
Well, interesting. I think that it's good that you are doing this at the end of your master's experience, because you all know each other very well, and so just seeing a little picture of each other on the screen there is enough, because you already know who you are and you already know where you're coming from. And so this would have been harder to do like in the first semester of the program when you weren't already a cohesive group. Samantha, you want to say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think it's really great. The only thing that I noticed was a couple of times it looked like maybe some people were trying to get attention to share an idea or a thought, and it wasn't caught. So I think.
Oh, you're right. You know why? Because I wasn't looking at this chat thing. I saw you said I can't find the raise hand button.
Yeah, which I did find eventually and put it on there, and then I don't think you saw it, but I know I saw like Kayla a couple times too, like trying to share something and it not quite getting seen. So I think maybe that's just something that we have to.
Yeah, well, that's me. I mean,
make sure people are being seen.
I've got to get better. I've got to get better because I'm going through a PowerPoint. I'm watching you, and I've got these bars on the side here where you hold your hand up or you chat, and I didn't look over there as often as I should have. That's good feedback. I think I could do better at that in future sessions. Marion, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that I'm finding this raising hand, lower hand, a particular exercise in self-restraint. Given our conversation about empathy, it was actually my New Year's resolution to stop interrupting so much. So this forces me to do that, and it's a great metaphor. I thought it worked great.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, if you've raised your hand or chatted and I didn't recognize you, unmute your microphone and interrupt me. I mean, that would be a simple way to overcome that problem. The reason why your microphones are muted is because otherwise there'd be background noise from 14 people that we would all be hearing, right? And so, as a matter of fact, do that. Everybody unmute your microphone. There we go. So now everybody's unmuted. And so if anybody sneezes or shuffles papers or anything, it clips. You know, the thing about video conferencing is when I'm talking, you can't interrupt me because I have to pause for your signal to get through. So if there's background noise, it interrupts the conversation. So that's why Matt suggested that everybody mute and then raise your hand and you know what? Next time, let's try to exclusively use raise your hand if you can, because it would be easier for me to look at one box than two. It's hard for me to keep them all on the screen at the same time. Okay, any other suggestions or observations? It's okay, right? It's not bad. I felt like it was okay. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll see you next Wednesday.